Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ASCM's The Chain podcast. Often on this podcast, we discuss how consumers play a significant role in shaping our global supply chains, and yet many of them don't realize the power they have. It is the consumers who have the greatest influence on our supply chains, from availability to the future of sustainability. That's why we invited Professor Merieke Stevens to join me today and discuss why it's essential that consumers, producers, and policymakers work together to improve the global supply chain. Merieke is a professor at supply chain ecosystems at RSM Erasmus University and a visiting academic fellow at the University of Cambridge Institute for Manufacturing. She serves as a department editor, Technology Management Department of the Journal of Operations Management, and her research focuses on how supply chain processes can be adjusted to improve economic, societal, and environmental outputs. One of her focus areas is the use of trust and digital tools to increase supply chain transparency and inclusiveness. Merieke, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Abe.
We got a lot to unpack. I think the first thing is what's been in the news recently, and that's the tariffs. On again, off again. We've heard this song before. I mean, this is not the first time that we've had a discussion on tariffs. But as a consumer, what do we read into this? What should the consumer read into the tariff discussion?
Well, being based in the EU is also still waiting to have a conclusive answer to what it will mean to us. I do think people for large purchases, such as their car, will pay attention to it. But most of the time, I suppose people are just at the receiving end of these policies and they wait until they know and see in the supermarket what this actually means to them.
It wasn't that long ago, the majority of people didn't even understand the term supply chain. So the impact of tariffs on them is probably really foreign. But yet this does have an impact on our supply chains. We're not immune to the decisions that consumers make.
Absolutely right. And I think if you say until a few years ago, people didn't really understand supply chains. We must mention COVID. And indeed, we were used to our goods and our services being delivered to us quite instantaneously. But indeed, COVID really brought home to us that this is not as self-evident as we thought it was. And that actually the global supply chains that companies run are extremely complex. The layer of tariffs is an additional layer that probably most people in their daily lives haven't been dealing with. But yeah, being based in the Netherlands now, we produce a lot of agricultural products. Incredibly important decisions are being made at the global era now that will impact a lot of our farmers, a lot of the industries that are dependent on this. So I do think that consumers will increasingly understand how important these global decisions are.
As you indicated, it wasn't that long ago that we had to explain to people what we did when we said that we worked in supply chain. Often it was what kind of chains do you supply or other discussions, really not a clear understanding. As you indicated, through the pandemic, global disruptions, the port strikes, it's brought it home to everybody. It impacts them on a daily basis. Do you think consumers have a better understanding of the power they have to influence supply chains, or are they still victims to the supply chain?
I'm not sure if most consumers will understand how much power they have. Availability used to be a given, so the consumer is now used to not everything being available, but understanding their own power in managing supply chains, or at least activating supply chains. I don't think most people have a clear understanding of this. And this is not surprising because, of course, your single purchase will not dictate a global supply chain, but collectively, what we buy dictates how supply chains are run. And in that sense, I think it's a good way to see a purchase as a vote. You vote for a particular type of product, and that product is then replenished because this is how supply chains work.
Interesting you talk about the vote, and every individual, every purchase that they make really does cast a vote. Companies respond to that vote, that demand signal. This is our holy grail as supply chain professionals. If you could tell me what the demand is, I know how to sequence my production and my deliveries and all my warehousing so I can meet your demand. Companies respond to that. What can companies do to be more in tune to what the customer wants? Because oftentimes we're responding well after the fact. We're trailing the demand signals as opposed to managing them real time. How do companies, keep up to date, not only with the demand signals, but respond to those changes in those demand signals?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, as you say, this is the holy grail, predicting demand signals correctly. The lean system, Toyota production system that many companies have invested resources in, where you hold low inventories, respond quickly to demands from a consumer, and then upwards to your raw materials. This is a system that companies are very well aware of. But it's also a system that is very difficult to run, as you indicate. Consumers switching demand, of course, for an operations manager is like their worst nightmare. And predicting that demand correctly is extremely difficult. But I do think that consumers often do not understand how important their demand signal is and what it means to a company to to be without demand. So really, without demand, there's no supply. It's as simple as that. So I think that from a collective consumer point of view, this is something that should be paid attention to, could be paid more attention to.
It's interesting. You described the just-in-time sort of process that we lived under prior to the pandemic. We were extraordinarily efficient. We had high volume of availability of goods. We had rapid delivery, often overnight, if not the same day, for a lot of consumers, reasonable prices. There was maybe sort of a blind spot that we had in terms of our supply chains being able to respond to the demand signals because they were consistent. We didn't have the variance in the demand that we had. Scarcity obviously causes a lot of disruptions within the supply chain, whether on the production side or in the retail side for individuals here. Current situation is much more, as you described, it's just in case. Much higher inventories that we're carrying right now. Our forecasting time has been shrunk significantly because we don't know the disruptions that are occurring, even 6 to 9 or even 12 months from now. So we're living in a much different time frame from just in time. Is just in time dead, or are we just pausing it until we get back to level or consistent consumer demand?
I do like to think that just in time, the way Toyota built it up after World War II, is still very much a great system to follow, because the idea within just in time was that your replenishment lead time matches, how long it will take you to get components or to get the parts that you need for your product. But this lead time has become much larger. Just in time never said as quick as possible. It said you need to have your components when you need it, but the replenishment lead time was very explicitly taken into consideration. And for example, if lead time before COVID was a week, it's reasonable to have a week of inventory. But if after COVID, your lead time may be up to a month, you need to have a month of inventory. It would still qualify for a just-in-time system. It's just that the replenishment lead time was lengthened.
It's interesting. Most of the time, it feels like all the consumers think about is how can I get it as quickly as I can? Why is it not in my doorstep already? They really don't consider the trailing effect of their purchases. Back to your point about the vote and what the implications as it ripples throughout the supply chain. Do you think we're getting greater awareness because of technology or information? I mean, everybody is talking about digital transformation today. Are we providing better, more accurate information for our consumers?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, because I think consumers are spoiled. If they can't get it right next door, they will move one store down and they will find it there, even in an online setting. There is not necessarily a loyalty to a certain outlet. And I think because supply chains have been so successful at fulfilling demands, the consumer has gotten used to that. If a consumer would realize the waste that is created by just trying to hit this moving target and be more willing to wait for the products, I think supply chains could, calm down a little bit and create much less waste than they are currently creating.
It's you talk about the waste in our system, and specifically, the determination for individuals, the criteria. As our good friend Yossi Sheffi at MIT says, the three primary determinants are price, price, and price. This seems to be consistent with your description in terms of, the individual's buying habits. How do companies, start to consider a little bit more mission-driven or more sustainable options for customers versus just price?
Yeah, that's again a question that has multiple angles, if you want to answer it. I do think that companies will have to. If you look at the European Union, there's very strong regulations already in place and being in place in the future that companies simply have to comply with. If you look, for example, at the fashion industry, in France, it's forbidden to burn new items. In the Netherlands, companies have to report in detail on their recycling. So that's one side of it. Regulation, companies will have to. I do think most companies are set up with a mission, with an intention. There's a founder who has a view, who wants to bring a nice product to a consumer. But some of this has gotten lost, in the cutthroat competition that we're currently, most companies are currently in. But you also see a shift at the consumer. So consumers are more interested in sustainable products, are also more interested in receiving information about the products that they consume. And if all these three collaborate or move a little bit into the direction of a more sustainable products, I do think there's an opportunity for supply chains to become much more sustainable.
It's interesting. You talk about, sort of organizations, making that first move. Are we waiting, is the consumer waiting for the companies, or are the companies waiting for the consumer to make that first move? Or is it a combination of both? Because right now it seems to be much more regulatory and policy versus the organizations indicating, we're going to move in this direction and we know it's going to be higher cost. Let's face it, we are faced in an environment today where Shein and Temu are sucking up a lot of the oxygen today about products. And to your description, if we continue to buy low cost, low value products, we're going to continue to make low cost, low value products because that's what the consumer wants. Where do we start? Is it the consumer? Is it the company? Is it regulatory? Is it policy? Is it everybody?
Yeah, it will be hard to have all consumers switch to more sustainable choices. Yeah. Many people will think about what am I putting on the table in terms of food in the evening for my family. Not everybody has a lot of time and a lot of money at their availability to really investigate what does my supply chain look like. I think if something is available, and especially, if you don't have these resources, people will indeed buy it. And you mentioned those two companies. As of today in the Netherlands, they're working on regulation also to tax all of those cheap products and also stress the safety issues that some of these products have. I don't think we can expect 100% of the consumers to care about this. There will be a group of consumers that says this is the company's responsibility. If I can go to the high street and buy this, where am I responsible? But there's also a group of consumers that has more at their disposal, who will make a more conscious choice. And I do think if you can, for some of your purchases, do make that choice. Because if there's more of those people willing to make a more sustainable choice, that might encourage companies to provide more information on their supply chains, and encourage others who maybe never thought about it to also, start thinking in that direction.
Are we providing enough information and education for consumers to understand the implications of their purchases?
I think sometimes it's hidden on purpose. So I don't think all information is shared with the consumer. So on the one hand, let's say you go to the supermarket and you buy eggs, and there's free-range eggs and your regular eggs, and there's a picture of the chickens. Then I think it's very visual to the customer. Okay, if I buy this type of egg, I'm not making a normative judgment here. The supermarket will replenish that. That will send a signal to the chicken farmer, either the free-range one or the industry one. And that information is not really there. I think we're swamped in green logos. There's so many different signals that we're catching on the packaging of the items that we buy. But I do think visibility in terms of pictures, maybe videos, VR is an option into supply chains, would be welcomed by the consumer. But not everybody benefits from that. There is producers who will not benefit from that. So I also think part of it is not shared on purpose.
Interesting. You point out the education part of it. The pandemic was a crash course in supply chain for almost every consumer across the world here. The consumer's perception of scarcity and availability was really detrimental to our supply chains, whether we're talking about PPEs or paper goods. The perception of scarcity, and if I don't get it, I'm not going to get mine. So nobody likes to see an empty shelf. Have we learned anything from the pandemic?
Yeah, I hope we did. I do think that people often optimize locally, so they optimize their own family situation, and that's the say-do gap. As you might say, like, oh, let's help these supply chains by having more of a regular demand. But then, if I'm deciding whether I want something to be available for my family, then a local optimal choice is made. So I also think that's a bit, in human nature to make sure that the group around you is well off. I do think the consumer learned. I do think that people were completely blind to what it takes to ship items across the world. This has become more visible. Yeah, I do think that's the case.
You talk about the visibility. It was one of the areas that, as supply chain professionals, that we saw a significant gap during the pandemic. We did not have clear visibility into our tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, where most of the disruption occurred. So we've spent an enormous amount of time, energy, and resources ensuring that we have visibility into the extended supply chain. So supply chain professionals can no longer walk into their C-suite and say, I don't know who or what is in my supply chain. So that's good news. The challenge now is that we now know who and what is in our supply chains. And what we're finding is that maybe we're not as sustainable and we're not as resilient as we were before. We're talking about strategic suppliers, that the impact of tariffs on different regions, on where we're buying from and where we're transporting, or the logistics. So back to your point about focusing on strategic suppliers and the extended supply chain and technology, are we still blind today, or do we have better visibility and information so we can make better informed choices today?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a bit of a cascading assumption that we have. If I have a great control of my strategic suppliers and they will have great control of their own strategic suppliers, we will know everything. But that is not the case. And I also think it's important to remember that there's immense number of overlapping ties in supply chains. Relationships are not exclusive. So I may know now who is in my supply chain, but amongst those suppliers are my competitors' suppliers as well. So information sharing, while it may be technologically possible, which it is, it's not difficult, might have other interests entangled with it that prevents information from being shared.
The technology solution that a lot of organizations have been investing significantly in, the digital transformation to get that visibility, to provide that information for organizations. We're getting better information. Do we have the right talent to understand the information and the data signals that are coming to us today? Because it is coming at us at an extraordinarily fast rate right now. The amount of information that AI can now encompass. Do we have the right talent to be able to use that data right now, or are we still going back to our Excel spreadsheets?
Yeah, spending a lot of time in the automotive supply chain, I do see a lot of Excel still. I think in a production setting, not every part supplier will have those skills in-house. But what I also think is important to consider, there is often a gatekeeper to sharing data. It's not self-evident for a supplier. Suppliers will run products from different car makers within the same factory, on the same line. I can monitor this digitally. That's not the complication. But how does my customer trust that I'm running this data collection now? This afternoon, we're producing for your competitor. I'm not sharing those data with you. So I don't think necessarily it's the technology problem, but it's this willingness to share information and the extent to which people are able to grasp what type of information they need. Mm-hmm. We have technologies that can basically record anything. You go into a factory setting, you can record any metric that you can think of. What is the one that I need to analyze, whether there will be a disruption? Who is the person in the supply chain that needs to know that first? I don't think these questions have been answered.
I'm going to go back to a point that you made before about the say-do gap, generationally. Individuals in my generation, I think you've described us as having a say-do gap, that we say that we're concerned about ethics and environmental and sustainability, but yet our purchases are not aligned with that. Are you seeing a difference in generational purchases and awareness of the products and the impact on our environment?
Yeah, I'm happy to say that I do.
Mm.
I'm not saying that everybody with every single background is able to make those choices, but if I look at the generation that's, in this part of the world, there's people who do think this is very important. Like vintage, secondhand has become a bit of a like a fashion identity item, which is good. I don't mind, what the motivation is. There is a willingness to spend more on products that are seen as more sustainable, and also the sort of the image that you're sharing with the world. There has been, more attraction to people that show the world that they are sustainable. So flashing your wealth in the generation, my students who are between like 18 and 25, that's not really standard anymore.
It's interesting. You indicated that the EU is a little bit further along, not only in terms of policy and regulation, but also in terms of the buying behavior for the consumers. They've been accustomed to it a little bit more in terms of the rhetoric and in terms of the implications of it. I believe, like you, that eventually America and the US will get there. But sustainability seems to be taking a little bit of a step back today in the environment and in the economics of what the implications are of sustainability. Are we moving closer or further away from sustainability as a key priority for organizations? Will they pick up the bit and run forward, or are they going to wait for either an impetus from regulation, policy, or the consumer?
Yeah, it's hard to ignore there's a bit of a worrying trend in the US at the moment. I also think that one of the points that requires, I think, some attention, it's not part of the curriculum of children in school. It's not obligatory. I mean, local decisions are made around what's in the curriculum. So I'm not sure if, this is really something that is seen society-wide as a problem. I do think there's people who think this is not a problem. And another part of that is that, let's say in automotive, the competition around electric vehicles, it's also presented as something that has been unfair because, the Chinese companies have received investments from the government, guidance, direction, really been supported by the government. So it's also framed as an unfair advantage. And investing in climate then becomes something that is like a setback or something that requires resources that should be used somewhere else. So that's a complex story.
So give me a prediction. I'm going to give you a couple of time frames. First, is it reasonable to think that we can make any difference within the next 6 to 9 months, or are we looking at a much longer term time frame, 3 to 5 years, in terms of seeing a much more informed consumer who has the information available to them, and they're making more informed decisions? Forget about better decisions, but at least more informed decisions. Or are we still in the same cycle that we're in today?
I hope I can say yes, it will be better within 6 to 9 months. But so much is happening at the moment. And, while on one hand, I applaud regulations in the EU, you also see that small, medium-sized enterprises leave, for example, to the US, because of the regulation is suffocating them here. So there's lots of moving targets in this discussion. And I do hope that with technology, consumers will be able to make this decision and choose to make a better decision. But 6 to 9 months might be a bit short. Let's first wait what the tariffs discussion comes up with.
So what's it going to take, 3 to 5 years? Give me what is key for us to move much further along to an informed consumer that's making more informed decisions. What are the key things that we need to pay attention to?
We need welfare. If we slide into economic crisis, this will move to the back seats. So people need some disposable income that has a bit of a buffer, because most of these products will be a little bit more expensive. And then I also hope that at one point we reach this point where people find it a bit unsavory to buy, from very unsafe, very unsustainable products. And that needs a bit of a phased transition. Enough people need to think that, if your neighbors are being delivered, some very big package with, very cheap and items that are not sustainable, ideally, there would be some societal dynamic there. I don't know if that's coming. It's coming a little bit in the Netherlands, but whether that will happen globally, yeah, I hope so. But I think if we slide into crisis, it's in the backseat again.
Yeah, I think we've all experienced how the crisis of the day does tend to move a lot of the priorities much further back. Thank you for joining me today. We could continue this conversation. Obviously, we're not going to stop here because in 6 to 9 months, I'm going to come back and say, okay, here are the predictions and let's see how close we are to them, because that's what we do. We predict and we try to get it right as much as possible. Our conversation today highlighted a critical and often overlooked piece of the supply chain puzzle. That's the consumer. It's a conversation we need to continue, and we'll come back to this. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.